Hi, this is Jurgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis vlog. Today's video is about suicide, understanding suicide, and how to help a person who is suicidal. So, a lot of the things that are viewed as common sense knowledge around the topic of suicide are in fact misconceptions and myths. So in the last 23 years, I've had the chance to work with a lot of clients who have had suicidal thoughts. Obviously, none of us have the chance to really peek into someone else's mind. We can't ever really know what's going into someone else's mind. And of course, we can't speak to people who have actually committed suicide, but I've had quite a few clients who have had failed suicide attempts. Granted, some of these attempts have been cries for help. Other attempts have been sincere attempts where the person has failed to end their own lives despite their best intentions of doing so. And I've had a lot of chances to have in-depth conversations with folks like this about their thinking process. And I'd like to share a lot of that stuff with you, as well as share a little bit about exposing the common myths around suicide. Now, I recently met a relative on a plane, just a chance encounter, and a person we had both known had committed suicide. So we ended up talking about it, and she said, suicide is a disease. It's like cancer. It's a disease just like cancer. It's a medical problem. It's obviously indicative of something being wrong with the brain. And the whole thing's just tragic. And hopefully one day some drugs will come out that will reduce, people's inclinations to kill themselves. Now, here's the problem. Most people seem to believe this, but it's wrong. Suicide is not a disease, nor is it indicative of a disease or an illness. A behavior is not a disease. So let's take a quick look at the difference between an actual medical diagnosis and a mental illness diagnosis. An actual medical diagnosis has been discovered for the most part in the lab. You can do objective tests that can discover or falsify the idea that there's some sort of cell pathology or infection or something like that going on. A mental illness diagnosis means the absence of all that. They are established through consensus voting, through psychiatrists getting together and voting about which behaviors and ways of thinking they shall classify and then market as brain diseases. But if you had an actual brain disease, you would not have a psychiatric diagnosis. You would have a neurological diagnosis. You would have a diagnosis such as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or a brain tumor or epilepsy or multiple sclerosis or something like that. These are actual brain diseases, right? So any so-called mental illness diagnosis is given because there's no evidence that anything is actually wrong with the person's brain. Now, of course, there might be. The point is, there is no evidence of it. So when I say that mental illness is a myth in a fabrication, am I discounting the fact that people are suffering and often suffering profoundly? No. But here's the distinction to make. Let's say someone comes to you and says, I had a heart attack. Cardiac arrest, I have a heart disease. That's a medical diagnosis confirmed by medical testing. Sometimes people get rushed to the hospital convinced that they have a heart attack, convinced that something's wrong with their hearts, and the tests come back negative, and the doctor tells them, we can't find anything wrong with your heart, you had a panic attack. Now, is it fun to have a panic attack? No. Is the person suffering and under a lot of stress? Yes. Do they have a disease? No. There's nothing wrong with the brain or the heart. Or if someone comes to you and says, I suffer from a broken heart, this person may be suffering intensely, may be suffering more than a person who actually has a heart disease. You know, the person's child may have died, or their spouse may have left them, or found someone else, and they may be suffering profoundly. So they say to you, I have a broken heart. I'm suffering from a broken heart. Is the suffering real? Yes. Is the person suffering from a disease or an illness? No. Not unless some medical test actually confirms that there's something wrong with the heart. So a diagnosis, so to speak, of a broken heart there is no such diagnosis, of course, but that would be a metaphorical diagnosis, right? So there's no evidence at this point that people who commit suicide suffer from a disease, or that there is anything pathologically different or wrong with their brains per se that make them commit the act. There's no evidence of this now in February 2020. Let me give you some compelling ideas of why this whole disease treatment way of thinking about it is not very useful. So, for example, in Brazil, in the Amazon forests, there is a tribe called the Suruha. That's probably not well-pronounced Portuguese, but there you go. They're a tribe who have not been very influenced by a materialistic worldview. So they have a very strong belief that when you die, your soul unites with lost relatives. So they don't really believe that your soul dies. It's just this physical organism that dies. Now, this particular tribe, between 1980 and 1995, 88.4% of adults, which they counted as anyone above the age of 12, died by suicide. 88.4% of those people. Now, this was a tribe in excellent psychological and physical health, known to be in excellent health with relatively few diseases. I think the average age was 35 years old. Now, they were very prone to commit suicide. I mean, slight disputes, slight frustrations in life would then encourage them to view suicide as a solution. They viewed suicide as the same way that many of us would view just relocating to a different city. So obviously nothing wrong with their brains per se. There's been quite a few jihadists who have failed to detonate their vests properly, failed suicide bombing missions, who have been interviewed after the fact. Now, many of these folks do not report being depressed. They view suicide as a form of career advancement, meaning, according to Islamic scriptures, this life isn't really real. This is kind of a preparation for the afterlife, which is the real life. And to die as a martyr secures your place with Allah, and it also secures your place with it also secures many of your family members as well. This is a great form of career advancement, so to speak. And many of these folks were convinced that they were acting upon the voice of God. They felt ecstatic, felt wonderful, felt completely at peace, completely convinced that the next time they would open their eyes, they would be with Allah in paradise. So I'm offering this. Of course, these are different cultures than the Western culture, but I'm offering this as counterexamples to the idea that if you commit suicide, something obviously has to be wrong with your brain, or you obviously have to have some, medical problem, or you obviously have to be deeply depressed. This is quite simply not true. So it's important to realize this. People often say that death is a part of life. Death isn't a part of life. Only thoughts about dying is. In the same way, people view suicide as a problem, or as sin, or as illness or disease. But for the person who actually commits the act, it's a solution. It's a solution, perceived solution. Might be a problem for the people left behind, but for the person who actually commits the act, suicide is a solution. Now, if you look at this a little bit historically, religion, of course, has prohibited, the official large religions have prohibited suicide. It's a sin. You're not allowed to, it's supposed to be up to God when your life on this planet ends. So it's a sin to leave God in that way. So suicide was viewed as sin, sinful behavior. The church would even punish. It would be a problem for the kids and the spouses of the person who committed suicide, in that they would often not inherit money, or the person who had committed suicide would not be have their burial site alongside other people who had died. Now, many priests who had a more humane orientation rightly saw this as, punishing innocent people. So after a while, when psychiatry kind of overtook many of the functions of religion in society, suicide became an illness, a disease. Now it's a semi-legal act in many places. So what's going on with people who have suicidal thoughts? Well, if you look at the work of the suicidologist Edwin Schneidman, who spent many decades researching suicide, he would always say that suicide is a solution, and that the person who is suicidal is suffering from psychache. You could say heartache in a sense, but psychache. They're hurting severely psychologically, and ending their own life looks like a way out of the pain. And for this person, there are severely frustrated perceived psychological needs. It might be a perceived psychological need for love and belonging, or for a meaningful life. So if we have these perceived psychological needs, and we really struggle in realizing them, or satisfying them, we end up with a lot of psychological pain. And if that pain becomes great enough, then the idea of ending our own life may occur as a solution. Remember, when we have a lot of excessive thinking going on, when we are in psychological pain and the wheels are spinning, our fight or flight systems are activated, we're struggling, we're suffering. This is not good for us. Our brain is then looking for a solution, looking for a way out of the psychological pain. Now, the brain, so to speak, is going to offer suggestion based upon its creativity that often have seemed to work in the past. For some people, it might be drinking alcohol that looks like a solution. For some people, it might be gambling. For some people, it might be sexual conquest. For other people, it might be developing psychosomatic pains as a distractor from unbearable psychological pain. Some people might begin to cut and slice themselves. For a lot of people, depressing in of itself becomes a solution, because depressing becomes a way of giving up, of kind of a kind of self-protective mechanism that the brain kicks in that says, look, this engine is running with way too much heat. This system is breaking down. We just need to pull the plug on this for a while. Like, just give up. Just nothing's working. Just give up the entire thing. Depression, or depressing more accurately, in of itself might look like a solution. Strange habits, whether it's pulling hair or being obsessed with germs or hallucinating voices or becoming obsessed about something, may be another way that the brain tries to distract us from our psychological pain, in the same way that migraine headaches or low back pain, may distract us from our psychological pain. Now, if nothing seems to be working, the brain's creativity may begin to just, throw out ideas of, just end your life, just kill yourself. That'll solve the problem. It is a suggestion, a solution of sorts. Now, of course, most people reject that solution the first time around. It may sound absurd. It may sound, I'm not going to do that. But then, if the pain keeps progressing, the brain may go, hey, what about this suicide thing? Just kill yourself. Just end your life. And again, the brain may, the person may reject that solution. But if nothing else seems to work, that idea may begin to appear more and more. And sometimes, ironically, the more the person gets used to the idea, the more the person gets comfortable with the idea, the more they kind of begin to contemplate that, well, maybe I'll do it. Not yet, maybe I'll do it. But then nothing else seems to work, and the suicide idea, keeps going. And then after a while, suicide may begin to look like the one and only true solution, right? Now, if we want to collectively reduce unnecessary suicides, we should educate ourselves psychologically. We should teach our kids. We should begin to teach people in school how to relate to thoughts and feelings in a better, more constructive way. Not poison people with fictitious diseases and lies about chemical imbalances and offering synthetic drugs as solutions to the pain of life. Look, there are some studies where people are put in a room. They're offered no distractions. There's nothing to look at. There's nothing to read. There's nothing to listen to. It's just them and their thoughts for 6, 12, 18, or 30 minutes. Most people report this to be an unpleasant experience. For a lot of people, it's a very unpleasant experience. Now, before people do this particular experiment, they're given these electric shocks, painful enough that they say they would be willing to pay money to avoid the shocks. Then the experiment is redone. Now you have to sit in the room again for 18 or 30 minutes with your own thoughts. But one solution to get away from the thoughts and the feelings are these electrical shocks. Now, over half the men, I think it's 67%, choose to actually shock themselves. A bit less than 50% of the women do. One guy had shocked himself, I think, 189 times in 18 minutes. But experiments like this shows that most of us could really use a different relationship to our own thoughts and feelings. If you look back at your schooling, your education, I'm pretty sure that you learned about mathematics and geography and history and stuff like that, and all of that is great. But I'm also equally sure that you probably didn't learn how to meditate. You probably didn't learn specific techniques or tools or do specific experiments to explore your own subjective experience, to learn how to see thoughts and thoughts, how to relate to your emotions in a productive way. So a lot of the psychache or the pain that we're going through is because when the shit hits the fan in life, we often don't have good ways of relating to our own internal experience. And we're often psychologically inflexible, not quite able to entertain other perspectives or to find other ways to satisfy what we perceive to be our needs. We fall for very basic distortions, such as taking the fact that we want something and then we turn it into these masturbatory demands of having to achieve, having to perform, needing love and approval, that the world needs to be in a particular way. And then if we fail to achieve or perform, we damn ourselves as human beings. Or if other people don't approve of us, we feel a lot of pain because we think we need the approval, and then we damn other people as human beings instead of just rating their behaviors. Or we damn the world itself or life itself as a place where existence is not really worth having, so to speak. Let's look at what else I had here. Yeah, so there was a guy called Lester Levinson once who had severe, he had heart problems, he had a lot of psychological stuff going on, and he discovered that the main issues lied in his own thinking and feeling, the way he related to his thinking and feelings. And he discovered through some experimentation that he could actually let go of emotions. So he developed something called the Sedona method, which essentially is these three questions. So let's say that you feel some sort of fear response or some sort of sadness or some sort of anger. And you may start off by really feeling into it, right? You really feel into it. And then you ask the question, could I release this? And then you ask the question, would I release this? And then you ask the question, when? So you're not trying to intellectually answer it, but you're just feeling into it and just kind of throwing that question into your own mind-body system. Could I release this? Would I release this? When? And a very interesting thing I've noticed with my own clients, and that a lot of people have noticed, is that if you give someone a very simple tool like this, and they start to work with, thinking and feeling responses that seem very ingrained, to begin with, the question may seem preposterous. It's as if the brain just yells back, "Fuck you!" Like, no, I'm not releasing this. Like, no way, I couldn't, I won't, I release. He's wrong. But then, if you can get them to keep doing it, people often realize that the question itself kind of is the answer, because just by feeling into it and asking the question, you kind of the brain is kind of forced to look at it. You're no longer fused with it, right? The brain's kind of forced to look at it and to consider it. Could I? There's no pressure, just could I? Would I? When? And even if the brain answers no, fuck you, the first 5 times, by getting the brain to kind of contemplate it, look at it time and time again, suddenly it's like, maybe I could. Then suddenly it's like, yeah, I think I could. And then suddenly it just drops. It just disappears. So there's something about that an idea can look preposterous at first, but the more you kind of feel into it and kind of contemplate it, the more real it becomes. The negative part of this is very often with suicidal thoughts. You know, for a lot of people who I work with as clients who have attempted to take their own lives and failed, they've said that, look, initially when the suicidal thoughts appeared, you know, it just looked preposterous. Like, I'm not going to do that. Like, no, I'm not ending my own life. But then due to the thought kind of appearing time and time again, and then and nothing else seeming to be working to, like, you have all these other options, right, to reduce your pain seemingly, but all the other options, you know, drop off. Suddenly the brain kind of gets used to the idea, and suddenly ending your own life looks like the thing to do. So what also very often happens is that the brain can kind of, you know, throw this idea up, you know, to end your own life as a solution. Sometimes people get so scared by that thought. Like, in and of itself, the thought is completely harmless. Like, in and of itself, it's just an idea. It's just a piece of language, just an image, just some body sensations. It's nothing to it. But where so many of us go wrong is that we kind of fail to see it as a thought, meaning we automatically start believing in it, and it suddenly starts to feel real, where it looks as if the thought is personal, that it says something unique about me, and that something has to be wrong about me for thinking those thoughts. And if the feelings I get then scare me, I'm going to have a lot of rumination going on to attempt to solve this. And the more thinking I get, the more pain I get, and the more real it starts to become, right? So I very often have people think their suicidal thoughts on purpose and help them see that thoughts are thoughts as they do so. And when people go through this, the thoughts themselves are increasingly seen as just ideas again, and they lose their emotional charge, right? Another thing that's important in terms of helping clients is helping them make a distinction between wants and musts. You know, almost always people have taken, I mentioned this earlier, but they've taken, you know, wanting to succeed at something, and they've turned it into, I have to succeed, I have to be perfect, you know, my life has to be that way. The thought in of itself isn't dangerous, but if you start to believe in it, and you start to identify with it so that it looks as if you are the person who has to succeed, well, if then life doesn't quite go the way you kind of demand that it should, it looks like an assault on you. It looks as if you are suddenly deficient, right? Or it's one thing to want approval or love or respect. You know, we're social animals. But if you start to demand it, if you start to demand that you need that particular person's love or approval or respect, well, the thought in of itself isn't a problem, it's just an idea. But when we kind of forget that it is a thought, it starts to look as if I am the person who needs this particular approval, right? And if I then don't get it, it looks devastating. It looks as if I am deficient in some way, right? And that other people are deficient in some way. Or it's one thing to want the world to be in a particular way, but if I start to demand that it must be that way, I suddenly lose track of the idea that this is just an idea. It's just an idea. Now it looks as if it's true. And it looks as if life itself may be the problem, right? So it all comes down to changing your relationship to your own inner experience, learning to see thoughts as thoughts, learning to relate to emotions in a more intelligent way, to learn to have the psychological flexibility, perspective taking, to achieve your perceived needs in more functional ways, right? So the people who are suicidal are disconnected in a sense. They're often disconnected from meaningful work, fulfilling relationships, friendships. That should be the orientation. Learning to relate to your own experience, to other people, to life in a more meaningful, in a more connecting way. Not this medical disease model that too much treats people like machines with broken parts. Now, something else to realize around this is that suicidal thoughts can be. There's this idea that if someone has tried suicide or wants to kill themselves and they're stopped in some way, they're just going to do it again, in some other way. That's often not the case. That's often not the case. Sometimes the idea to kill ourselves can be a very sudden, a very sudden, impulsive idea that if we're vulnerable enough, if our stress levels are high enough, in that particular instance, at that particular time, in that particular context, it can look like something to be acted upon, right? So I remember once I met a guy at a seminar where we talked about this particular topic. And he told me the story of having been suicidal, and he had decided to end his own life. He was completely committed to doing it. And he had picked out this particular bridge that he was going to jump off. And he arranged everything. And he was walking towards the bridge. And as he told me, he was completely certain that he was going to do it. There was this girl, he was 19, I think, at the time. There was this particular girl or woman that he had a crush on, who he was, convinced didn't like him. She, by happen chance, just ended up walking by with some friends. She spotted him. They, of course, had no idea that he was going to kill himself. They just spotted him walking. And she smiled and she ran up to him and gave him this big hug, and kiss on the cheek. And they started talking, and of course she had no idea of him being suicidal, and she ended up inviting him to this party, and it just so shook him out of his orientation that he ended up going to the party, and he still didn't tell anyone there about his suicidal urges, but that was it. Like, he never reached that particular stage again. I remember reading some statistics about U.S. police officers that they were 2 to 3 times as likely to kill themselves with their own gun than they were to ever be shot by a criminal. So a lot of this probably has to do with some of them ending up in a very dark place and then right then and there just having access to that weapon. I'm pretty sure that for quite a few of them, hadn't they had that easy access to that weapon at that particular time, that particular night, they probably wouldn't have done it, and they may never have reached that particular point again. There's something else too to support this, and I highly recommend reading Malcolm Gladwell's newest book, Talking to Strangers. He has a very interesting chapter about this, and what he talks about is after the First World War in Britain, they started using town gas to power stoves and water heaters. This was manufactured by coal, and you had hydrogen, methane, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and carbon monoxide, which is of course, which of course gave people an opportunity to kill themselves in a way that was painless and very, very easy. I'm just going to find something from the book here. Let's see here. So I'm reading from Gladwell's book. Town gas had unique advantages as a lethal method. Criminologist Ronald Clark wrote in his classic 1988 essay laying out the first sustained argument in favor of coupling. Now, coupling is the idea that a particular behavior is linked to a particular context, right? So there's an argument that sometimes suicide is contextual, and it's a behavior related to that particular context and that particular context only. Okay, so it was widely available in 80% of British homes and required little preparation or specialist knowledge, making it an easy choice for less mobile people and for those coming under sudden extreme stress. It was painless, did not result in disfigurement, did not produce a mess, which women in particular will try to avoid. Deaths by hanging, asphyxiation, and drowning all usually demand more planning, while more courage would be needed with the more violent methods of shooting, cutting, stabbing, crashing one's car, and jumping off high places in front of trains or buses. So, a lot of people ended their own lives by putting their head in the stove. Like, it was an easy access thing to do. Now, during the 60s, you had a lot of suicides by this. Between 1960 and 1977, Britain changed from town gas to natural gas. And in suicide rates, so I think 1/3, like in 1962, if I remember correctly from the statistics, 1/3 of suicides in England and Wales was being done through town gas by sticking your head in the oven, right? Between 1960 and 1977, suicide rates just plummeted, right? Because you could, by natural gas, you could no longer stick your head in the oven and kill yourself. So that kind of proves that it's often not the case that if you take away that particular option, that they will just go jump from a bridge. A lot of them will not necessarily do so. Same goes with, there was some filmmaker who followed a bunch of people who had attempted to kill themselves by jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Vast majority of them, never did it again. Even the people who were stopped, the vast majority of them, never did it again, and never did it again in some other context. I also remember reading about a guy who had saved over 60 people by suicide. He had a cabin by a bridge where a lot of people, it was very popular for people to jump from that particular bridge. He saved around 60 people, and all he did was to invite them in for coffee, and a conversation. And that can often be the difference that makes the difference. It doesn't necessarily mean that people will then just kill themselves in some other way. That also kind of challenges the whole disease model, right? If you start to look at these counterexamples, I think it's pretty obvious that that's not the place to go. Having said this, there's very little evidence that suicide prevention really works. Nor is there much evidence to prove the idea that psychiatric incarceration really works. People kill themselves and end their own lives in psychiatry all the time. So I mean, if someone really has committed to ending their own lives, they're going to do it. You know, you can't really you can't really stop a person who's completely committed to doing that. Maybe we should stop talking about suicide as if it's a sin or a crime or a mental illness, and we should just talk about voluntary death. You know, from a materialist standpoint, I'm not saying that materialism is true. I'm just saying that it's the dominant worldview in the Western world at the moment. From a materialist standpoint, death is both birth and death are involuntary happenings, and of course the church and the state insist on it being that way. The whole topic of suicide is really a great philosophical question, because it comes down to self-ownership. Who really owns your life? Like, if you own your own life, how could it be a sin or a crime or an illness to end it? We could talk about voluntary death. Some people choose to voluntarily end their own lives. I think people should have the right to voluntarily end their own lives. For that particular person, suicide is a solution. Do we have the right to say to someone, look, you have to remain in the torture chamber of your own life because of my attachments to you, or because of my religious beliefs, or because of my socialist status, commitments? Do we really have that right? I think if we have self-ownership, we should have the right to end our own lives voluntarily. Now, if you have young kids that you put to the world, I don't think you should grant yourself that right. I think you have an obligation to be around them until they can be able to fend for themselves. But even in Nazi Germany, in the death camps, people were stopped from committing suicide. You weren't supposed to die by your own hand. People would be brought back to life and then sent to the showers, so that the state could execute them. Even on death row in various countries. You're not. There's suicide watch. Set up so that you can't end your own life. You're not supposed to end your own life. Your life belongs to the state, right? So the state shall have the power to end it, not you. I fundamentally disagree with this. I don't think we should use coercion to attempt to force people to live if they don't want to. I don't think we should incarcerate people for wanting to end their own lives. I think we should do what we can to help each other and to create a meaningful life as possible. But consider this. If you are so-called dangerous to yourself, or if you advertise that you want to end your own life, you'll often get thrown by coercion into psychiatric treatment. Now, of course, if you're forced, it's not a hospital, it's a prison, right? If you're forced, it's not treatment, it's torture. But it's really ironic to consider that if you had cancer or some sort of heart disease, and the surgeon says, look, you need this surgery unless you're going to die, you still have the choice to decline, to say, no, I'd rather die. I'd rather do something else. The surgeon and the medical team Even if you're a danger to yourself by not doing the surgery, they're not going to come to your house in the night and kidnap you and forcibly put you on the operating table. You know. So this whole stigma of mental illness gives the state the opportunity to control people in a way that I personally disagree with. And of course, whether you agree with someone's choice to end their own life or not, let's make a case that there are, rash times when ending your life may be a very rational decision. Let's say you have some sort of illness. You've given up the idea that there might be some sort of remission. You know that from here on it's just going to be pain and misery. Voluntary death, I think, is a more accurate term than pretending that ending your own life is a sin or a crime or indicative of an illness in any way, shape, or form. Anyways, hope that this... Oh, if you want a good book recommendation, you can check out The Suicidal Mind by Edwin Schneidman. He was a suicidologist who researched suicide for decades. He got some fame due to being able to predict, based upon letters, often decades before people killed themselves, who was actually going to kill themselves or not. Another great book is Suicide Prohibition by Thomas Szasz. You can also try Fatal Freedom by the same author. That's Thomas Szasz, S-Z-A-Z-S. Hope this stirred some thinking in you. Feel free to offer your comments, your thoughts, wherever you find this video. If you're curious about working with me as a client, if you would like to change your relationship to your own thoughts and feelings, you can connect with me at provocativhypnosis.com. If you're curious about seminars regarding my psychological illusion model, you can find information on the seminar page. And if you're interested in mentoring, you can also find videos and information about that as well. Till next time.